Okay. I'm going to move on to health effects of low-level ionizing radiation, which is on page 11. Another one of the deceptions, and I have no other word for it, deceptions of the nuclear industry and the nuclear regulatory agencies is that they focus on cancer. Okay? So not only do they underestimate the cancers, and they'll say, you know, you'll only get 1 per million or whatever at a certain level, but they don't like to talk about other health effects that have been associated with ionizing radiation by scientists. They like to stick to their mathematical models of what's going to happen. So I just want to quickly go over here a list of some of the health effects besides cancer that have been associated with exposures to low-level ionizing radiation in the scientific journals, okay, that I've been reading. It's an immune system suppressant. It's probably one of the biggest things. Your strontium and uranium both like to go to bones. They both like to go. Strontium, the body thinks it's calcium. So when you take in a particle of strontium in something that you're eating, it can latch itself onto bone. And inside the bone, of course, is where our red blood cells are made. And what happens, and all of our immune system comes from that bone marrow inside the bone. So basically, the immune system suppressant effect comes from destroying those red and white blood cells. So the doctors in Tokyo right now have noticed immediately that the immune systems of the children is just down on the floor. So they're suffering from a lack of what they call neutrophils, or these white blood cells that are helpful in immune system protection. When the children go out of Tokyo, when they're have a little holiday away from a contaminated area, then their neutrophils go up again. So it's an effect. It's almost an immediate effect of even exposures at low levels. So lowered numbers of white blood cells. Obviously, all cancers can be induced, and I'll talk about that. The model that the ICRP has is a model of radiation harm that's based on a 25-year-old European male, white male. And actually women, it's shown in both the atomic bomb survivor studies and many others since then, that women get about 50% more cancers per exposure than men. So the model doesn't affect women. And children are hundreds of times more susceptible, which is why a fetus being X-rayed is going to get a 50% chance higher of getting leukemia. Okay, all autoimmune disorders are associated, like allergies, lupus, MS, asthmas, chronic fatigue. Anything that's autoimmune is related, has been related in the literature. I'm not saying that every single one of these health effects is definitely caused by radiation. I'm saying that in the scientific literature, some of these health effects have been, all the ones I've listed here, are associated with exposure. Obviously, they can occur without exposure as well. Endocrine system disruptor. I have a whole list of references here that I've looked at. Diabetes, other problems with the pancreas, growth rate, head size. Right now, right near Hanford, they're having a whole cluster of babies born with very tiny head size, small head size. Very common around Chernobyl. Hanford is one of our most contaminated areas up in Washington because Hanford was where the plutonium was produced for the bomb that landed on Nagasaki. And they've been doing stuff ever since. It disrupts metabolism of fish at low levels, uranium and water. Nervous system, one of the most common birth defects associated with low-level radiation is a neural tube defect. Neuropathy in infants is associated with the mother's exposure, also peripheral neuropathy, which is seen in all uranium areas, not just on the Navajo reservation. So there's a whole cluster of children born with neuropathy, which involves you can't move your hands or your feet very well. A whole cluster of those children born in uranium areas, contaminated areas on the Navajo reservation in northern Arizona, and it was associated with the mother drinking uranium-contaminated water during pregnancy. This happened, but this doesn't just happen here. It happens in other uranium-producing areas around the world. Cataracts and ocular disease. associated. Even the ICRP accepts cataracts as a relationship to radiation. Reduced reduced IQ and mental retardation. Ireland right now is about to sue the United Kingdom because of the cluster of Down syndrome children that were found downwind from Sellafield nuclear power plant, which had a meltdown in 1957. It was called wind scale at that time. But there are clusters like this. So Down syndrome, reduced IQ. The Radiation and Public Health Project reported that in 1963, when children were born, this is in the United States, okay, 1945 is when we first started getting our major exposures from the Trinity test in July. So when those children who were born in 1945 reached the age of 18, there began a 20-year decline in the SAT tests in the United States, okay, which only improved when the tests were taken by those who were born after the cessation of the above-ground nuclear tests. Okay? The above-ground nuclear tests I'm going to talk about because those are very, very important. So I just want you to note that is the case. It's related. Other mental health issues have also been associated with radiation, including schizophrenia, which has been noticed both in the survivors of Chernobyl as well as the atomic bomb survivors. Slight increase. Okay? I'm not saying every schizophrenia is caused by exposure to low-level radiation, but there are schizophrenias that are statistically in a significant way associated with exposure to low-level radiation. Some aggression as well. I haven't done much on that, but it shows up in the literature. Muscle tissue, heart disease, I already talked about that. Ischemic heart disease associated with ingested body burden levels of radioactive cesium at Chernobyl, and of course cancers of all kinds. The nuclear authorities deny that there are any health effects under 100 millisieverts. That's their definition of low level. Millisievert is one of those measurements that gets people confused, but it's fairly up there. Some of the independent scientists are suggesting now that some of these effects can be found at levels as low as 2 millisieverts, which is about, our normal background radiation from cosmic rays and from minerals in the earth is about 3 millisieverts a year that we would get a year. Okay? So if you add even 2 millisieverts, even less than doubling of background, some of these effects have been found. Now, they're found in 1 out of several thousand. Or, for example, I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but Tularosa, New Mexico, which was downwind of the first Trinity bomb test in 1945. I think the National Cancer Institute now, 70 years later, is just starting a study. The problem with making these epidemiological studies is if you look for effects, then you find evidence. So they tend not to study. They tried not to study this as much as possible, the nuclear industry. Okay. Tularosa, I think that the normal incidence of brain cancer is around 1 in 10,000. Tularosa has about 5,000 people and about 10 cases of brain cancer. So some of these incidences, when they are increased, they're not increased in a way that you can notice. There's not people falling down the street. Small communities can just think it's our little problem. It's our family problem, right? Whatever it is that's happening. Okay. All right, and I did talk about evidence of harm for women in ionizing radiation a little bit, and for the fetus especially. None of the nuclear industry radiation standards apply to the fetus. None of them. Various studies show excess miscarriages, stillbirths, changes in menstrual cycle, low birth weight babies. That's one of the most famous ones. Almost immediately after, within a few months. Because the fetus is so sensitive. And within a few months of the Fukushima atmospheric plume, Joseph Mangano, who's a statistician and a scientist, he found a statistically significant increase in miscarriages and low birth weight babies on the west coast of the United States. This was also found as an effect after Chernobyl. Okay. Also found as an effect of the nuclear testing. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna. How are we doing on time? How you give a team? Okay, I'm gonna skip 15 minutes more. Okay, we got the most important stuff. Some of the most important stuff. what you find here, I'm going to start now with a little bit more about the nuclear chain, but what I want you to know is that every step in the nuclear chain involves releases of low-level ionizing radiation that can affect the local population's health in ways that people may not even associate with it at all, because it may be very small, maybe a small effect, maybe a big effect. I mean, leukemia, for example, one of the only things they know that causes leukemia is radiation. The ICRP said there won't be any leukemia after Chernobyl because, let's all say it together, the levels were too low. But they found leukemia in 5 European countries after Chernobyl. And because of that, and it might be 5 in 100,000 or 5 in a million children had leukemia. Okay? But that effect is so powerful from radiation that they know it's caused by radiation. The ICRP model, if it had been correct, those children would have had to receive so much radiation they would have had skin burns to get, So we know now, I just want to emphasize, we have a lot of independent science that shows that the nuclear authorities' model of harm is incorrect, that it has been falsified repeatedly, especially by the data since 1986 from Chernobyl. Okay, uranium mining. A lot of these problems, the uranium that was used at Hiroshima came from 3 places. It came from Namibia, came from Canada, and it came from the Navajo Reservation. It came from the Navajo Nation. And there was a huge uranium rush in the 1950s, and there are pockmarked pockets of uranium all over the Four Corners. And everywhere people live near those tailings, all the miners, about 50% of uranium miners will get cancer. And about 50% of people who get cancer will die of it. So if you have 2 million cancers, only the incidence is way higher than mortality. And about 1 million people would die from that. Okay. So basically there are millions of tons of uranium tailings polluting the American Southwest, and especially on lands of indigenous peoples. Okay. So what we have is uranium mining almost entirely taking place on indigenous peoples' lands in North America, in Africa, and in Kazakhstan, and in Australia. And so almost every place where uranium mining is taking place on the lands of indigenous peoples. Okay. Niger and Namibia, for example, those people are extremely vulnerable to Arev's lies about the health effects of uranium mining. Okay. Because Areva is a French company that basically owns the whole community. It's too low to cause everybody's like, people are noticing the health effects, and people are having asthmas, and people are having cancers, and people are having miscarriages, and the fish are dying, and Areva's like, I'm sorry, those effects have nothing to do with radiation because the levels are too low. Okay, okay. So I'm not going to linger there. What I want to move on to, I'm sorry, I had a lot of information here, but I knew I wasn't going to get through all of it. I just wanted to share it with you so you had it in a piece of paper here. Uranium mining, what we've got are increased tumors among Nigerian uranium workers, increased leukemias in Czech uranium miners. I'm on page, let's see here. I'm on page 14. Okay. Birth rates are reduced among human beings living near uranium mines in Romania. Congenital malformations increase. There's a significant amount of research on ways to remediate uranium-contaminated waters. When we go up to Cameron next week, we're going to emphasize some of those because I'm going to be walking into a community where the children can no longer drink the water at the elementary school. So this is a desert area in Cameron. Whole Navajo, and not all of the wells and springs on the Navajo Reservation are contaminated, but the EPA is now trying to clean up some of the tailings and clean up according to their idea of what the level of harm is. And many of the springs and wells in this incredibly desert area, the EPA has said, don't drink here, don't use this well, don't use it for your livestock. It's like, okay, so what do people do? They've been sitting there without a solution for 50 years. There are some solutions, like distillation of water, for example, can remove the heavy metal contaminants as well as reverse osmosis. Filters, but people don't have any money on the Navajo reservation to keep buying reverse osmosis filters. So people are working on this. Okay. Okay.
Wait a minute, you're saying that these filters can actually get out the radiation?
The uranium. Uranium mining, the main problem is uranium, although it creates a lot of other things like arsenic and other non-radioactive heavy metals. But it's different. It's like in each one of these steps, so uranium mining, it's like a shadow, a small shadow of what happens, say, in other contaminated areas like Chernobyl, which are fission products. Uranium mining really is a very low level of radiation compared to what is emitted in a fission accident. But we still have the shadow of the same types of health effects going on here. We also have in the second step of the nuclear chain in uranium milling and enrichment and processing, lots of studies of workers, again, who are suffering from some of the health effects that I just outlined. Okay. So respiratory effects, cancers, immune system effects, low birth weight babies, so on.
What does this include? I'm sorry.
Right.
In depleted uranium here, is this included?
In depleted uranium as well, because I have that at the very end here.
Okay.
But basically about 98% of natural uranium is a form called uranium-238. They add these numbers at the end of the name in order to indicate how many particles are inside the nucleus. That's all that number means. It's a different type. So there's uranium-238, has 238 particles. Uranium-235 has 235 particles, and so on. Uranium-235 is the one that they want, but it only, for nuclear power and nuclear bombs, but it only is about 1% of uranium ore. So they have all this depleted uranium, which, after enrichment, which they were just sitting as waste, which they then converted into weapons that the United States used in Iraq and the former Yugoslavia. So some of you are aware of that as well. But again, in those areas of Iraq, extreme effects have happened because that form of uranium is now non-soluble and is likely, and it's such a fine particulate matter that they found that some of those beta particles are so tiny they can get through the skin a little bit and they can go up through the nose, which normal uranium, the uranium mining doesn't actually do. You have to breathe it in. So there are a lot of extreme effects happening from that, and there's a lot of science on the depleted uranium, the severe congenital malformations. Again, because uranium can bind to the DNA. So if it goes, it has a chemical composition that likes to bind to the DNA. So if it's circulating in the blood near the sex cells, then it can potentially mutate or damage the next generation. So DNA mutation is another one of these things that, although it's very controversial how long it lasts, the the nuclear industry says there were no genetic effects at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's their blind. All the independent science shows that, for example, if the parent is exposed, their germ cells are exposed, that the children can then get leukemia or cancers or other health effects down the line. And that with these genetic, and Rosalie Bertell, of course, would say that these genetic effects continue for generations. One of the problems with low level radiation is that it's low level. If you have an acute external exposure, like a nuclear bomb, most of the cells that are exposed are going to die. People within a radius, there's millions of people are going to die. When you have these long-term, chronic, internalized radionuclides, it's a different kind of exposure entirely. It's inside, and the cells, instead of dying immediately, they can just kind of get the DNA as the cells divide. The cell can keep on living, but the DNA has not been repaired, or it's been messed up in some way. Okay, so in some ways, some scientists have found that the lower the level of radiation, because the cells survive in a mangled form instead of just dying, that those cancers can maybe be a little higher per exposure at lower levels than even at the higher levels. Strangely enough, it's counterintuitive, but there have been several studies that have found that. Unnecessary uses of medical radiation. The nuclear industry likes to point out that 50% of our annual radiation exposure usually comes from X-rays or CT scans, which are higher than X-rays in terms of their radiation. And about 50% of our annual extra man-made radiation. Okay? So they point this out and say, well, see, you know, you're getting all this radiation from your X-rays, so these particles of cesium can't possibly harm you, you know, because it's such a lower level than an X-ray. But again, an X-ray is a very sudden. It's usually the electron volts that are involved are usually lower than, say, an alpha particle inside your body, and it goes out again. But the only thing I want to say about medical radiation, although there have been lots of effects again found from X-rays, okay, so there are lots of studies that show, for example, let's see.
You're at 55.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, am I? Okay. So there are lots of studies that show some health effects, that 15 CT scans would cause between 1 and 100 cancers in every 220 people, for example. So we have a lot of science showing, you know, and all I can say about medical radiation is that sometimes people need it to save their lives. So just let's all try to reduce the amount of medical radiation that we're exposed to, because we have so many exposures from someplace else. So that's all I want to say about that. Nuclear weapons, I think most of us are kind of aware about nuclear weapons. I'm not going to go into nuclear weapons too much. Except to say that you have to lie about the effects of low-level radiation and particulate fallout in order to use nuclear weapons. In order to make people believe that they're usable, and you can hide under the desk or hide in your fallout shelter for 2 weeks and come out and somehow you're going to survive, the recent studies have shown there is no civil defense for nuclear weapons. There are no civil defenses for that. Okay. I really want to get to atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, however, because people are always afraid about the potential for nuclear weapons causing harm. Of course, obviously. Nuclear weapons can incinerate millions of people in minutes. So, of course, we're afraid of the end of the world happening from nuclear weapons exchange. What we don't look at, and what we're not encouraged to look at, are the effects that have already occurred from the use of nuclear weapons. Okay? Now, the ECRR has calculated the amount of radiation released by all the atmospheric weapons tests so far, and they have found that they would result in approximately 52 million cancer deaths worldwide. Now, these are the nuclear weapons tests that took place between 1945 and 1963, when nuclear weapons above-ground testing was banned for most of the international community in 1963. Most cancers have, of course, the height of cancers after exposure usually comes at some 40 years after exposure, the most numbers of cancers. The ICRP estimates just over 1 million people worldwide have died from the atmospheric nuclear weapons testing. The ECRR yield is 52 million. Okay? The ICRP doesn't take infant deaths into account in their model at all. We're looking at approximately 1 million infant deaths from atmospheric nuclear testing. And I just wanted to point some of that out, and I'm going to skip through here because...
Excuse me,
Yeah.
what page?
What page am I on? I'm on page...
After nuclear power.
No, before nuclear power. Atmosphere, we're in nuclear weapons here, and we're on page 19. The top of page 19 is a table from the ECRR, which is comparing the amount of radiation from nuclear weapons with the amount of harm caused by that radiation in the two models. The ICRP model is about 1 million, the ECRR model is about 52 million. Okay. I haven't really talked about nuclear power yet. Obviously, we're here because of Fukushima. Fukushima, there have been 10 nuclear meltdowns since 1945, at least. That's as many as I could find so far. Okay. There's another one in Switzerland that I haven't researched, so there might be 11. But there are 10 so far. Fukushima is by far the worst of these nuclear power meltdowns. Okay. But they're not as bad as atmospheric nuclear testing. This is the strange thing that people don't realize, and I didn't realize it either until I started studying this. And if possible, I'd like you to just skip real quick to...
Towards the end?
Yeah, the evidence of harm. I want you to skip real... quick to page 29. Sorry, I should have put this earlier. If you can skip to page 29 and look at the chart at the top of page 29. This is the entire scheme of things here, including nuclear meltdowns and global nuclear tests, weapons fabrication. What you see here is an estimate of the amount of radiation from the ICRP and versus the ECRR. So the ICRP estimates how much radiation came from the global nuclear tests, the weapons fabrication, nuclear power production, radioisotope production for medical use, accidents, nuclear accidents, and so on. And the ICRP figure for the total cancer death is, again, for the whole nuclear chain, the entire nuclear project since 1945, is again just over 1 million. So if they say about 1 million came from atmospheric nuclear testing, then the other 173,000 are from all the rest of the nuclear chain, according to the ICRP. The ECRR is that we're looking at 61,600,000 cancer deaths. In some ways, cancer deaths is easier to count in statistics because you know it's happened. Somebody's actually died. But they also, you can count infant death and fetal deaths as well as part of that project. Okay, a pitabecquerel is what they measure when they're really dealing with high numbers. So it's 1,000 billion. 1,000 billion becquerels is one pitabecquerel. So 1,000 billion becquerels is 1,000 billion disintegrations, atomic disintegrations. Okay? And you'll see on that chart how many of those, how much radiation was released from the atmospheric testing, which is by far the highest amount of radiation that humanity has ever been exposed to in our entire history.
But that's total, all the total testing?
That is all the total testing from all the countries, from the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, now India, and so on.
But it's so big.
It's so big.
It's so big.
It's so big compared to Fukushima, which is the worst industrial nuclear power accident we've had, and Chernobyl. The ICRP says, again, 30 people died from Chernobyl. The ECRR estimate is about 1 million cancer deaths from Chernobyl meltdown. So since Fukushima is approximately twice the amount of radiation released from Chernobyl, we're expecting approximately twice that number of cancer mortalities. And that's just cancer. I'm not talking about the other health effects. And basically, we're looking at a revelation here of evidence of health effects that increased starting in the 1950s, of all of those health effects. From diabetes to low IQ to low birth weight babies to cancers and so on. And because it takes 40 years, the cancer rate, I don't know if anybody noticed, but the cancer rate started going up, particularly after 1985. Coincided with the Chernobyl release, which was also global. Fukushima release was global. Every single exposure is going to cause problems. And everything we can do to reduce our exposure is going to help us reduce our risk of these health effects. Okay, so anything we can do. Because Fukushima is unusual among all of the nuclear power meltdowns because it's still not contained. So there's an enormous amount of groundwater coming from the mountains flowing through under the plant. At least one, possibly all three of those, depending on who you ask and what the site, nobody knows. But there definitely have melted down through into the basement, at least one, maybe all three. The groundwater comes through the basement and out to the Pacific Ocean. So although Chernobyl is melted into the basement, the water didn't get to it. You know, Arnie Gunderson, who's a nuclear engineer, was like, doesn't matter whether the cores are out of the basement or not, the water has found the cores. The water is in contact with a very high level of radiation. I'm not talking about low-level radiation anymore. I'm talking about water that has what they call 1 sievert per square meter. 1 sievert is what you would get. You would die within a couple of weeks if you were standing next to a nuclear reactor. Okay, this is a really high level, not a 1,000th of a sievert or a 1,000,000th of a sievert. And that water is still continuing to go into the Pacific Ocean. And, it's not in our air, but it's in the breathing environment of, obviously, the whales and the bluefin tuna that they've studied. All the bluefin tuna in the Pacific that they studied has cesium-134 in it, and cesium-134 is absolutely a signature of the Fukushima meltdown. Arnie Gunderson has said that those levels of their estimate, that release in the Pacific is going to probably last for at least another 100 years.
So much for the next 7 generations.
So, unless they can find, unless the international community comes together and all donates hundreds of billions of dollars, and they somehow manage to create an underground concrete like bubble around the entire plant, which we're talking hundreds of billions, and right now they've been busy just ignoring Fukushima and pretending it hasn't happened. So personally, I'm not holding out major hope that the entire international community, at least not this year, is going to do that. The other thing Arnie Gunderson pointed out was that those releases made across the Pacific, we found them, this is the water plume, okay? Very different. The air plume happened in the first 2 months in 2011. This is the water plume, which is now, we have evidence just a couple of weeks ago. This water plume has arrived in British Columbia on the coast. Okay. These are, and there's very different, you often hear in the media the term 400 tons a day of highly contaminated water is going into the Pacific Ocean. That is TEPCO's figure. Okay, 400 tons a day is the figure from TEPCO, the company that's in charge of Fukushima. There have been independent scientists from EnviroReporter.com who have done all kinds of calculations. I don't know how accurate they are, but they've done all kinds of calculations about how much water is actually going into the Pacific, and they estimated 17,000 tons a day. So, pick between those. They're both bad figures, 400 tons or 17,000 tons a day. So what we need to do is try to protect ourselves from food. Basically, I've stopped eating fish from the Pacific. Now, you might eat some bluefin tuna, and it doesn't cause you any harm. You're not going to notice it. You can't smell it. You can't taste it. But in 20 years or 40 years, it could generate a cancer if there's cesium inside and it stays inside your body. So it's like playing Russian roulette with a gun that has thousands of bullet chambers. Okay? You can eat a piece of fish now, and it may not cause you any harm, or you could eat a piece of fish now, and you could get cancer in 30 years. Okay? So from these very small particles inside the fish. So if you want to protect yourself and your family, I would really strongly recommend not eating fish from the Pacific Ocean for the rest of your lives. That's the truth.
What about seaweed?
Anything from the Pacific Ocean. Salt, seaweed, fish, anything. Those levels are bioaccumulating. So they're hitting the coast now. They're going to be, as far as we know, hitting the coast for at least, and I think Arnie Gunderson is being optimistic, but at least the next 100 years. So it's just going to increase. The levels of radiation hitting the west coast of the United States are just going to increase over time. It's going to be higher next year than it is now. Okay? But again, in the water, if you're in the water swimming around and you have beta particles and alpha particles, you're not breathing it in, you're not drinking it. Step into the Pacific. The Black Sea right now has about 100 becquerels per square meter from Chernobyl, because all the water comes out of Chernobyl. You can't isolate these elements. They are natural, not natural elements, they're man-made elements, but they just integrate themselves into life everywhere we are. They integrate themselves into plants from the soil. They integrate themselves into our bodies. So the other things that we can do besides watching our food, and again, the plume, the atmospheric plume for Fukushima there are slightly higher levels in California, west of the Sierra Nevada, because that's where the water hits. So where there are high rainfall areas, sometimes that's where the higher levels of radiation fall out. But there were hot spots, and I have some references in here for the amount of cesium that were found in rainwater, oranges, pecans. There were cesiums and other elements found in lots of foodstuffs, and one of these slides has a list of those. So watching how much food you get from California, even, will probably reduce risk. It's not going to kill you right away, by any means. This is a long, slow problem. It's not like we're going to die tomorrow. This is longer and slower than we can possibly imagine. that these levels and how long it takes for them to affect. Also, and there's a whole bunch of other suggestions for how to protect yourselves and your families from these exposures, which we are now living in a radioactive world. We all had exposures from atmospheric testing. We all had exposures from Chernobyl. We're all getting exposures from Fukushima. They found plutonium from Fukushima in New Mexico at their monitors. So we know that there was a plutonium, when the explosions happened at Fukushima, some of that plutonium, which all nuclear reactors create plutonium, some of that plutonium went airborne and crossed around the world, and some of the cores burned and went up in the air, and some of the cores melted and went down into the ground. And again, right now there is absolutely no way of containing Fukushima. They can't even get close enough to see where the cores are. They don't even know. So we are dealing with a serious problem because the nuclear authorities, again, are saying too low to cause any harm. And so I would invite all of you to, we can pray about this and we can do what we can to try to break through or fight against that ongoing deception that has been the deception we've been living with since the beginning of the nuclear age, which was, it was all born in the time period of nuclear weapons, and that's why it's so secretive, and that's why they have refused to really take on board the new science. And this is perhaps one of the worst things about it. You go to Los Alamos, where we were last summer, or summer before last, and they're very proud of their scientists at Los Alamos, you know. They're very proud of their scientific approach, but really they're not taking on board this new data. They're refusing to look at scientific data about harm from low-level radiation. And this is the worst thing you can find in a scientist, right? It's like, you know. So, and we're all at risk. And we're all downwinders now. All of us are. So we need to go through, as Rosalie Bertell said, on one bright sunny day when we were sitting in England, I said to Rosalie Bertell, I said, I hear that about 1 in 3 people are going to get cancer these days. And she said, well, because they lie about the cancer statistics, I think it's more like 1 in 2. I said, how do you cope with this? How do you cope? And she said, you just kind of have to walk through this veil of death and understand the truth of this thing. You walk through this veil of death and you come out the other side of it somehow. I'm not saying that's an easy process for any of us in our consciousness, is to understand the depth of what's gone on over the last 70 years, but I think it's crucial because I think that although these are some very long-lived radionuclides, I really believe that the sooner we can bring the nuclear age to an end, the sooner the Earth can begin to heal itself. And I think we just need to have more awareness about what we can do. We can actually take some action that the Japan Green Action has asked us to take, and that is to put pressure on the Japanese government, because the Japanese government wants to reopen nuclear power plants in Japan. The company that has been really trying to get uranium from not only the Grand Canyon, but a sacred site in New Mexico, and indigenous sacred sites in Montana, and in the Black Hills, they're all waiting with bated breath for the power plants in Japan to restart so that there's more demand for uranium. So what the Green Action, the people in Japan are dealing with this, they're dealing with an incredibly tight secrecy law, and they're asking for help. Because if they speak out about radiation now, they can be subject to arrest in Japan because of the secrecy law that was passed in December. So what we can do is we can support the people of Japan, and in that we can support ourselves in trying to get rid of this deception that we've been living with for 70 years. So please take action and call the Embassy of Japan and tell them to not restart those nuclear reactors, and tell them how concerned you are about Fukushima still releasing radiation into the Pacific Ocean, and ask them to please focus on trying to contain the nuclear reactor at the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima as much as possible. Okay, I'm sure there are a lot of questions. What I'd like to do maybe is we could just spend a couple more minutes, because again, it's very, very difficult information for many of us to understand what we've understood. And I think if we just have a couple more minutes of just kind of prayer and silence in this wonderful space, that we can just kind of ground ourselves, and then maybe take a break and come back for discussion for those people who want to do that. Does that sound good with everybody? Okay. Thank you very much.